My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Vice President at Public Policy Institute of California, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, I know you're all familiar with PPIC, but we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with offices both here in Sacramento and in San Francisco. It's our 25th anniversary since we were created. Our program today is on the fiscal challenges of declining enrollment in California schools. And to kick things off, you'll hear from Paul Warren, who will share the main findings of our recent report, Declining Enrollment in California Schools, Fiscal Challenges and Opportunities in the Coming Decade. See, we're trying to be more optimistic in this decade. That's awesome. If you'd like hard copies of the report, there are copies available at the registration. We're trying to be a little green, so we're not making copies and putting them on every chair like we used to. The full report and technical appendices, as well as the Paul's presentation, are available online at ppic.org. We'd like to thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and PPIC Donor Circle for their support of this event and today's lunch. Following the presentation, Julien Lafortune will moderate a panel of education finance leaders and experts to broaden the discussion. You should have received an agenda today on your chair, and all the speakers' bios are there on the back side, so in an interest in time, we'll only do brief introductions today. Please note we have an online audience, and so be sure to wait for a microphone when we do our Q&A section so that they can hear the questions. And a couple of housekeeping things before we begin. Later today you'll receive a survey, and this isn't about the presidential campaign, so you can answer it. But please do that because we do take your advice into consideration. And please turn off and silence your cell phones. California has long been a magnet for people from all over the United States and from the world. My parents left New Jersey after high school and drove to California till they ran out of gas. I would have been born in San Diego, but they ran out of gas in Hollywood. Or so they tell me. They did tell me they also walked uphill in the snow in the summer to school, but these are things that I have to deal with as an adult. My husband's family came from Mexico to find a better life. My parents and my husband's parents were not alone. For most of the state's history, we have seen rapid population growth, both through migration and through high birth rates. However, in recent years, things have begun to change. Demographic projections from the Department of Finance and others have suggested that our population will slow, and most importantly for schools, we will have a declining number of school-age children. Since California schools are paid on an average daily attendance basis, when the number of students decline, the amount of money schools get is reduced. Well, it's a little more complicated than that in California. There are very few serious finance at school experts, only a couple people, I think, a handful, no Prop 98. It's a very difficult issue, but I'll leave the complexity of this issue to the presentation. But what I wanted to leave you with is that PPIC has recently gone through our strategic planning process where we developed our 2025 plan, and understanding California's future is our priority, is one of our priorities. This effort will look beyond the immediate public policy issues and instead analyze key demographic, economic, environmental, and policy trends to anticipate major challenges and to identify practical policy solutions. This report jumpstarts that effort. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Paul Warren. Paul has had a long career in Sacramento, where he worked for LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office, the legislature, the superintendent of public instruction, and of course, PPIC. He's been an invaluable resource to the state and has grappled with some of the most important issues facing education policy in California. Today is his last day at PPIC. He is retiring. Oh, I know. We're sad. We'd like to thank Paul for all your wonderful work at PPIC and your many contributions to education policy. You will be missed. But he says he will join us here for the beer bread in the future. So with that, I want to introduce Paul.
So just a word of warning to people who might want to work at PPIC. It is my last day, and they're making me work. So thanks for coming and joining us at this dialogue on declining enrollment in California. My co-author Julien will come up here and moderate the panel discussion, and Radhika Malhotra, who worked with us on the paper, is also here. So afterwards, if you have questions, please feel free to approach any one of us. We can help you. So why write about declining enrollment? Well, as Deborah said, the Department of Finance projects that declining enrollment is going to intensify over the next decade. In the past 10 years, enrollment's been pretty flat, declined about 1.5% over that time, and finance is projecting that it's going to decline by 7%, which means more districts will be declining and the size of the declines are going to be bigger. So why is that a problem? Well, as Deborah said, funding is tied to attendance, and attendance and enrollment are pretty much the same thing. So fewer kids, less money. Declining enrollment also has state budget implications, and that's important for people in Sacramento to think about. And finally, we also think that, oh, you know what? I should use my clicker. We also think that the state can help districts kind of get through this, this challenge. So this shows a regional sum up of what has been happening with enrollment in the past 10 years and what finance projects for the next 10 years. And you can see the blue bars are the past 10 years, right? And most areas of the state were growing, some quite rapidly. The South Valley had big enrollment increases. And the South Coast, which is Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego, did decline pretty significantly over the past decade. The brown bars are the next 10 years. And you can see the South Coast, Central Coast, and the Bay Area, but the two big population parts of our state, the Bay Area and the South Coast, are both expected to shrink quite a lot, okay? The other parts of the state really aren't going to grow very much. Sac Metro and Northern California are really kind of small in population relative to the Bay Area and South Coast. So what we're going to see is a lot of districts in decline, or in other parts of the states, maybe just kind of holding steady. Now, the Department of Finance doesn't do district projections because it takes too much precise information about what's happening in each district. But this shows for the last 5 years what's happened in the 10 largest districts in the state. And 8 of the 10 declined in this past 5-year period. 7 of those 8 are in Southern California. So we would expect that all of these very likely will continue to decline and face the different kinds of pressures that declining enrollment brings in the coming 10 years. So when you think about how does it work at a district, what changes in districts as their enrollment shrinks? The first thing we wanted to do is just to chronicle what's the experience that districts have had in the past. So we looked at districts that had 2 consecutive years of decline, and we found that there's kind of 2 groups. One that has a relatively short, it's about a 4-year period of decline, and you can see the brown line is that it kind of stabilizes. It continues to decline a little bit on average, but it pretty much stabilizes at that 4-year level. The other group has a very long-term decline, and even after 10 years, it's continuing to decline. And this gray shading shows you kind of the 95% confidence interval so that you can see that this is a fairly good description of what's happening out there in districts. Perhaps the most important thing about this chart is that you're not seeing district attendance popping back up, right? It's permanent, okay? And so districts really have to understand that when these declines occur, most likely this is something they have to wrestle with. They can't just go, well, it may come back in a year or 2. So as Deb said, fewer students leads to lower revenues. Attendance goes down, revenues go down. Now, do costs go down in the same way? The answer is no. We took a look at some data and did some projections, and we think at best that the direct savings from fewer students really adds up to only about half of the ADA losses. Those direct savings are teachers, right? You have fewer teachers, you need fewer classrooms, and things, textbooks, and other things that occur during the year. So what does that mean? That means districts have to cut costs out of other things that aren't so variable, like transportation or district staff. And those are harder cuts to make because they affect all students. They affect the operations of the district. So, so these kinds of declining enrollment really create some difficult decisions for districts. The state does help out districts that are in decline by giving them a one-year kind of hold harmless. So if your ADA goes down, your funding is based on last year's attendance, which helps you for that 1 year. But of course, in the next year, then you have to live with the smaller number of students that you have, and you have to adjust your budget. So, you know, thinking back to that chart with the 10-year decline, the declining enrollment is helping those districts because it's giving them a slight bit more money every year, but every year they have to make cuts. So, you know, it's not solving their problem by any stretch of the imagination. So right now, about half districts are declining, and we wanted to understand what happens to district finances when they decline, and we found three really interesting things. First of all, you could see that district per pupil spending was higher in declining enrollment districts. And you go, well, why is that? And then you go, oh, well, that's how the declining enrollment adjustment works. It gives them a little bit more money per student than other districts are getting. So we think most of that is the declining enrollment adjustment. Second, you see that districts retain their experienced teachers while maintaining class sizes. Okay, and we think that's probably mostly an artifact of state law and local contracts, right, which kind of outline how these things work. And then finally, we found that districts didn't close schools very often. Mostly the schools just got smaller, okay? And we went out and we were talking to districts, and they said, well, you know, people like their local schools. They don't want them to close. It's part of the community. It's where people meet. It's where stuff happens there that's important for the community. Also, the savings from closing schools just isn't really that big. So when districts weigh that choice, they stick on the side of keeping their schools open rather than closing them. So for the state, there's two main effects that declining enrollment has. First, there's the cost of the declining enrollment adjustment, and that's going to vary by, you know, how many districts are in decline and the size of those declines. And we estimated that in 14-15 it was $600 million cost, and by 18-19 it was up to $925 million. So you can see it's a chunk out of the budget, and we expect that that's going to continue to grow. Declining enrollment also affects Prop 98. And for those of you who aren't, into school funding, Prop 98 is the constitutional provision that says the state has to spend a certain amount of money on schools and community colleges every year. And there are 3 tests that are used to determine that minimum level of funding. And under Test 2 and Test 3, which have typically been the tests that have been used to set the level, Prop 98 funding is reduced by enrollment if enrollment is declining. Of course, if enrollment's going up, then it increases it. Under Test 1, though, the minimum guarantee is not adjusted for enrollment. And in a declining enrollment environment, that's good for schools because that means that they have a slightly higher Prop 98 amount than they would otherwise have. And based on the LAO's November report, where they did some projections of enrollment for the next few years, we estimated that increase in per pupil funding for schools is about $100 per pupil each year. So it's not a panacea, but it's a nice little amount of additional money that the school system can use. So what should the state do? Here's what we recommend. First, we think the state should take that $100 million or so, or $100 per pupil or so, and it should put it in base budgets for school districts. And why would you do that? Well, we looked into try to fine-tuning an adjustment for declining enrollment districts, but we also recognize that their districts are wrestling with a variety of other cost pressures. There's pension costs, STRS and PERS. There's special education costs that are going up pretty quickly. And of course, then there's the general kind of cost increases. Employees want raises, things cost more over time, PG&E costs are going to go up. So we thought it made more sense just to give them some unrestricted funds that they could use to meet the challenges that they face. The second thing we recommend is that we provide some technical assistance to districts. Many districts who are going to enter into declining enrollment, like in the Bay Area, haven't really necessarily faced this in a long time. And so the budget people are not really experienced with what the successful practices that districts have put together to address declining enrollment. Also, there's a lot of small districts that really struggle with doing the kind of enrollment planning that really could help them see what's coming down the road and do a better job at keeping their budget in good shape. So with that, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until after the panel discussion, and we can have a good discussion at that point. I'm going to ask Julien to come up and our guests, and we have a panel discussion here for you. Thank you.
All right, so thank you, Paul, and thanks again, everyone, for coming out today. I'd like to introduce, starting from the left, we have Renee Arkus with us, who's the Executive Director of Fiscal Services at the Long Beach Unified School District, Sara Bachez, who's the Assistant Executive Director of Governmental Relations at the California Association of School Business Officials. We have Claudia Davis, the Associate Superintendent of the Calaveras County Office of Education, and Mike Fine, the Chief Executive Officer of the Fiscal Crisis and Management Assistance Team. So first off, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us and helping to provide some key context and perspective on what is an important issue that the state will face and that many local districts will face, especially in the coming years. So I'd like to begin by asking a question to the entire panel and give each panelist the chance to respond and talk a bit about their role and the perspective that gives them, that role gives them on the issue of declining enrollment. And so specifically, I'll start with you, Renee. So from your perspective, what are the key challenges due to declining enrollment, and how important of an issue is this in your specific context?
Absolutely. Long Beach Unified in particular has been experiencing decline for the past 15 years, and we've lost about 25% of our population. And so for a school district of our size, it is a very large issue. As a matter of fact, in the finance position that I'm in, I know no other than decline. And so some of the specific challenges we face are the speed, and the spread is how we like to refer to it. How it's going to happen, how fast it's going to happen to us, and the preparation for that is key. If we're not prepared and financially aware of what's happening, there's no way that we can keep up with it. And the spread and the number of students, that equates to about 1,500 to 2,000 students each year for us in particular. And the spread of that over 83 schools is really impactful because you can't keep up with it. You can't change things fast enough when you're dealing with that kind of spread.
Sara Bachez with CASBA, representing 23,000 school business leaders in both finance and operational side of public education. For us, as we develop professional development and we're responsible for CBO training programs as well as advocacy at the state capitol. When we feel the pressure of increasing services with one-time support from the state, that sends the wrong signal to local LEAs. We're seeing also the growing demands for special education. Our funding formula for special education, AB 602, is based on our overall enrollment, our overall ADA for all students. And so when we see the base shrink and yet our numerator grow in terms of the demand for special education, that gives us palpitations of how do we address these growing demands. We must meet the needs and supports for that population. And then at the same time, we have pension costs, healthcare, we've all seen throughout the state, growing upheaval of how do we address proper compensation for our staff. Our staff are also experiencing housing issues. Our families are experiencing housing issues, which then adds to the declining problem that we're seeing in the Bay Area, in LA, and certain areas in Southern California. So we're part of all of those discussions that we must remind elected officials as they're making decisions on housing, on transportation, facilities, is that we can't change the sizes and the demands of our buildings and needs for repair as quickly as we're addressing then declining enrollment. Those buildings don't just go away. The needs for them are very dire, given that most of our buildings are over 25 years old. And so how do we ensure that we're properly sequencing all of these decisions in a multifaceted manner, and also communicating back to the state that do not mandate ongoing requirements with one-time support?
Claudia Davis. Calaveras County has also been experiencing decline for the last 15 years. We are a very small county, however. Our largest school district is under 3,000 students. And the issues that Long Beach Unified has dealt with are exactly the same issues. We have the added challenge of we have offices with 3 people in them, district offices with 3 people. We get to kind of an economy of scale issue for us where you just can't cut anymore. Because the work all still has to get done regardless of the size of your district. Geographically, our county is pretty dispersed too, where we have rural, schools up in the mountains, where parents don't want their kids put on a bus for an hour to get to the next school. So school closures don't happen. We have very small schools with 40 kids in them because of that reason. So being able to respond timely absolutely happens, but we have less of a tool set to really be able to do that in the smaller counties.
So I think Claudia and Renee give us a good picture here that while they're both very large district, very small county with small school districts and small schools, both being impacted in the same way, but their abilities to deal with that impact and mitigate the impact are dramatically different. A school with 40 kids in it means we already don't have a teacher per grade level, right? We've got combo classes and other things. So reducing costs in that environment when you lose 4 kids, 10%, 4 kids, basically results in no opportunity to reduce costs. So you start to understand the dynamic that we're dealing with when we look at this across the state. We also have to remember a couple of things. Claudia's, as a small county representing small districts, is not abnormal. She's not the exception here. More than half of our districts across the state are less than 2,500 kids in total, right? Long Beach, in some respects, is the exception, right? Is the 3rd largest district in the state. And so when Claudia speaks to the hindrances and inabilities to adjust, we have to understand that impacts the majority. That circumstance represents the majority of districts. So Julien, as I step back and look at the state as a whole, the consequences here, the challenges are, I see generally about 5 significant budgetary pressures out there. 2 are on the revenue side and 3 are on the expense side. On the expense side, and Sarah's talked about them, special ed, and under our current formula, it's tied to total enrollment. So total enrollment's going down. Special ed revenues then are going down, but in fact, as a percentage of enrollment, our special ed population's increasing, okay? And within that special ed increase, we have almost doubled the number of kids within our special needs population that are severe over the last 10 years. And so as we double the number of severe kids, that's where our costs are. It's far more expensive to serve a emotionally disturbed or autistic student that falls in that severe category than it is a student with I'm going to say simple, I'll be beat up for that by my own teacher wife, but the issues of language and the need for language services, speech services, speech and language pathology services. Those are 2 completely different issues. So, and then the next one's pensions, which Sara talked about, and I think probably the room is very familiar with the issue there. The third being compensation. This is a people business. 85 to 90% of every dollar schools spend are on people. The biggest piece of that is in compensation. We have to be competitive to get the very best. We already have shortages, historical shortages in a number of areas, and we have to pay our folks right. On the revenue side, the challenges are right now for the budget year coming up, a relatively low cost of living adjustment. Yeah. And not only is it relatively low, but it is quite a bit smaller than what was forecasted 7 months ago, 8 months ago, right? And so that's the real impact in the districts, is they have to update their forecast. And the second revenue is our topic. It's the declining enrollment topic. While it's maybe just over 50% of our districts, represents a much higher percentage of our ADA, districts that serve our ADA, and therefore there's bigger implications for that.
Thank you. Sara, I'd like to keep the discussion going. For those of us who aren't as familiar with school budgets, and I know Paul touched on this a little bit, and we've talked about some of the cost pressures, but could you speak a bit to the fiscal challenges that districts have in finding cost savings? We know that districts also have fewer students to serve, but why is it so difficult to proportionally reduce these costs?
Something that Paul mentioned was state laws and requirements in terms of who we could lay off, and retaining then more experience, which also translates to much more on the expensive side staff. And so we have first in, first out policies that prevent LEAs to really assess what type of teacher do we need, what's their expertise and experience, instead of when did they come into the industry, how long have we had them. And so we have to make decisions in these constraints where it makes it challenging to decide how, knowing that the folks that just came into to our profession are on the lower end in terms of how much we pay them. That doesn't generate us enough resources. 85 to 90% of our budgets are tied into compensations and benefits. And so we also have to then look at what is our non-instructional side, and that's our classified staff and instructional materials at a time when we're changing into the next generation science standards, new math requirements. We're transitioning to the 21st century of educational learning, yet you're using 20th century technology. Our classrooms are not updated to meet the demands, and with aging infrastructure, all of these pressures make it very challenging in terms of what do we invest in, how do we deal with attrition, how do we then have conversations of maybe providing some sort of bonus for retirement of certain staff, and then how do we triage who do we have in our ability to then serve our students. It is a very complex decision, and unfortunately not that streamlined, but I think something we miss at the LEA level is that community engagement, really communicating early, as soon as possible, and promptly, because if the community is not informed, if they don't understand that on the horizon we're seeing this decline, that we're not communicating, that we're recognizing that because of housing pressures, we're seeing families migrate away from our communities, we won't be able to meet the needs that they have been used to.
I'd like to add on to that. One of the pressures we're seeing is exactly the kind of effect of people moving out of the Bay Area, moving into more affordable areas like ours, which means our housing costs go up, et cetera. But we're also, when we talk about students with disabilities, proportionally we are seeing students that we've never had to deal with, that need very intensive services in a community that schools don't have the ability to deal with. We need to create program to help. But also our social services in general are lacking. So we have, our county mental health agencies and other social services that aren't prepared either. So it ends up being this compounding effect of schools are having to provide a lot of wraparound services in our small communities that we're not equipped to deal with at this point.
And so we've talked a lot so far about budgets and resources and decisions that are made at a higher level, but I think we deserve to talk a little bit about, at least it deserves to be spoken a little bit about students and what the student experience is and what it's like for families. So Renee, I'll start with you, but I invite the rest of the panel to chime in as well. And so from your perspective, how do these types of cuts and downsizing decisions affect students and the resources, the opportunities that are afforded to them?
Yes. Well, as we do these cuts, we're constantly looking for efficiencies or any other way to keep it away from the classroom. I mean, that's one of but like we said, 85 to 90% is our staffing, and that's usually where we have to look first. The students are often impacted by higher class sizes, in some small cases, school movements when we need to make changes to locations, especially for special education students are impacted often as we try to find areas that we can place them that will provide them with the best services possible. And I think the extra resources that we provide to students that many parents may consider above and beyond the K-12 education are the first to go. And some of those areas are probably most key to our students for their mental health and just some of the things that get our kids to come to school.
We found in our communities, programs suffer. We have class sizes that are larger, but we also, schools that had music in elementary school, they no longer have music in elementary school. Various programs they do, schools do their best to go to teachers last, but support for those teachers, instructional aides, those kind of resources, it becomes a financial decision every time you're looking at how do we support the classroom. Again, our district offices have 2 or 3 people where we're doing, we've got staff doing just about everything in our very small school districts. The superintendent could also be the principal, or you could have a teacher who, is principal as well. So there's a lot of impacts that way where we're really trying to keep the best educational program, but it does come down to limiting what that program can be.
I think if we're currently employing somebody, providing a service, supply item, spending money in some fashion that doesn't have a direct impact on the classroom, then we're having the wrong conversation to start with. So it's impossible, generally speaking, to make cuts that don't impact the classroom. It's a great term to use, and it helps at a board meeting when this is the audience to help settle them down. But if they really thought through it, it's the bus driver that is the first adult that greets a kid in the morning and the last adult to say goodbye, from the school district's perspective, the last adult to say goodbye and to check on their welfare and to know how they're ending their day. And for many of our kids, unfortunately, that's a key connection, right? And so it's a very difficult thing to say that we're going to cut XYZ service and not think it has an impact on a kid. So I'm going to take us back, and this is easier to say. I'll be the first to say this is much easier to say than to do, but we now, as a result of the local control funding formula, have things required of all districts called the local control accountability plan. It sets forth what's important to us as a local district. There's not a one-size plan for the whole state. It's developed across our 1,100 districts. It is to be community influenced and stakeholder influenced and reflect the priorities of our stakeholders. And our kids are our stakeholders, our teachers, our staff, our parents, our business community, lots of folks obviously make up that group. So what does it say that's important? And that really should be our guiding light and our guiding direction as to then what we define as a core service and a critical service to a child or to different groups and subgroups of kids, right? It used to be, before LCFF, districts, the most important item the local school board took up each year was the adoption of the budget by June 30th, right? And then they'd go off and spend a week in the summer planning. Well, that's ass backwards, sorry. And Governor Brown recognized that, and his advisors recognized that. We have to be governed by the plan first. The budget should be completely secondary and almost ministerial to how are we going to accomplish this plan. And so that plan works in good times when we're increasing to have additional resources, and it should work equally as well in difficult times, whether that's because of a low COLA or added expenses or declining enrollment. And it must ultimately guide us. Kids are going to be impacted, though. Table 1 in the report is a great illustration, and Paul, you touched on it in your slides. We get about 50% on the dollar, 50 cents on the dollar savings. When we lose $1 of revenue because of a lost student, we're only able to realistically, in a perfect condition, capture 50% in cost savings, right? So where's the other 50% come from, which is the basis of your question? It's going to be an impact somewhere. It costs just as much to send that 84-passenger transit bus on its route from point A to point B, whether it's full or half full, because we lost a few kids. We still got to get to Johnny's house or Johnny's corner, that's 10 miles away. And so, but the plan ultimately has to identify what the priorities are, what we keep. We have to clearly define what are our core services that we can't do without. And then everything else is up for discussion. And let me also put a positive spin on this. So during the Great Recession, I was deputy superintendent in one of California's large districts. I closed a couple schools, but it wasn't about closing them because of reducing enrollment. It was what we needed, what we saw, and the vision we set forth to turn them into. We closed one elementary school with less than 200 kids right on the edge of the district and right next to a UC campus. We turned it into a STEM academy. And we turned it from 200 to 700, right? And there's no law in California that says you can't poach your neighbor's kids, right? So by having it right on the district's boundaries, we literally poached several neighboring districts' kids, right? And a STEM focus next to a UC campus opened up an opportunity for a partnership with professors and labs and all kinds of things, right? So we actually grew our enrollment as a result of that. But that was a difficult decision for that very small community around the UC campus to have their local elementary school closed, right? It's turned into a very positive thing. So looking at this through the lens of what can we do to increase, often our school boards say we have no control over our budget, right? The state just tells us what we're going to get, and we're constrained to spend it in a certain way. Well, you do have control over enrollment to a certain extent, right? Dual language immersion, STEM, STEAM, you name it, kinds of programs will attract kids, not only from your neighbors, but potentially, this isn't a monopoly anymore, right? We have competitors. So for potentially from a private or parochial school, a charter school, whatever the case may be. So there are opportunities there as well on the revenue side, not just on the expenditure side.
And something that Mike Fine and I were part of last week was early education. That maybe this is the time to start thinking, if we have the ability with facilities, if we have an opportunity, is this the time to then invest in early education, preschool, and kindergarten classrooms to then begin that trend of restoration?
If we serve those preschoolers, they're naturally going to stick with us for TK, K, and so on, right? So it's just an earlier opportunity to build that relationship with a family. Great opportunity, because many, to repeat Sarah, I guess, many districts, many schools don't have preschool programs because facilities have been a limitation, right? Well, an empty classroom is a great, preschool's a great smoke to fill that empty classroom. That was probably a horrible.
We won't tell your wife.
Funding schools on gambling and weed, now we're doing cigarettes too.
So I wanted to touch a little bit more on something you brought up a few minutes ago, and that's the planning process specifically. And maybe, Renee, we can start with you, because I know Long Beach has had a lot of these challenges, but has been able to find success despite some of these challenges, both enrollment related and otherwise. And so I wanted to ask, how important is the planning and forecasting, both in terms of the budget and in terms of enrollment forecasting, for dealing with these types of declines? And is this something that the state could provide more assistance in, or we should perhaps think about in a different way?
Absolutely. The planning process and this decline in the budget is key and is the only way that some districts can survive this. And, we like to say that just in the enrollment piece, trying to figure out who's going to come and what's going to happen, and what we were talking earlier, Claudia, about what affects our districts and what's actually causing the decline, that's one of the key pieces that we would love some support in, especially from the state, if they can help us research that further and figure out just what's causing this, what are some of the things that we can do, and utilize all of our resources to prepare further.
For small school districts, it's absolutely necessary because they don't have the capacity, just the human capacity, to do that kind of work. Long-term planning is difficult when you're day-to-day just trying to keep the doors open and deal with whatever is happening that day. So building kind of capacity in our schools for planning, to be able to look at things like preschool as opportunity, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I just don't have time. I can't think about that. That is really, key for our small school districts, is changing that dynamic for them.
I already alluded to the overall plan of the local control, but now let's get down to the detail. The devil is always in the detail. And so the state requires school districts to do multi-year financial planning, current year plus 2 years. Not unreasonable to think about 5 years, but the farther you get out from the current year, the softer the data is, especially on enrollment. The devil's absolutely in the details. Claudia is 100% correct. It's interesting, though, that in our smallest districts, we know our families the best. We know what's going on in our community the best. So actually projecting enrollment in a little school district should be pretty straightforward. Let's be honest, we know who's just moved in, who's pregnant, all that in a larger district we don't have that data for, right? At least not legally, we don't have that data. And so, but they're very limited in their ability to do that because often the principal is also a teacher and the custodian and maybe the bus driver, right? And so that becomes a challenge. Long Beach, on the other hand, from a pure size, and then we got everybody in between, right, has the ability to do that planning, probably has in-house demographers, probably even uses a reputable demography firm to help solidify maybe even their own. So there's several sets of eyes looking at that data, right? But the detail is critical. By grade span, by school. I was in a district, we took great pride in forecasting our enrollment, and 3 years in a row hit it within 3 kids of 44,000 kids. We blew it, though, by grade, by school, all over. We had teachers in places, we didn't need them, we didn't have teachers other place, and so on. So it's back to the devil it's back to the detail, right? And so we've got to do that. We have to keep it up. It's the only thing. Those multi-year financial plans, I say regularly, you do it, you update it, you laminate it, you paste it down at the cabinet table so that every decision made around that table is through the lens of what's the impact going to be on tomorrow. If you can get away with it, you paste it at the board seats and force them to make decisions by looking at that. And that's the only way you're going to survive.
And imagine if the state was able to provide this support and resources throughout our LEAs, we would then know what type of teacher do we need, because we're talking about declining, we're talking about reductions at the same time that we have a teacher shortage, that we have a staffing shortage, that we rank 40th out nationwide in terms of how many adults we have per children. And it's, again, we're a service industry. And so if we had that information, we would know exactly where to invest, how to communicate with our teaching credential programs, with higher education of this is where we need you to focus on. These are the criterias and the direction as we're investing in teacher recruitment and retention programs. But again, we're working in silos, we're working in different spheres where really this really could be a potential opportunity for regionalization with cities, counties, and LEAs part of the conversation of how do we address housing, how do we address homelessness, how do we address affordability, how do we address all these issues that all our families and our educators are impacted.
The tools exist to do this. So this isn't an impossibility, right? I mean, even for FCMAT, we write software all the time, provide tools to school districts free of charge. Just go to our webpage and download it. We have Projection Pro that we just released last August after 3 years of development that does these multi-year projections. It doesn't answer all your questions. You got to put the data in there school district by school district, right? But it provides the platform to do it and to keep it up. So for a small district, a small county, or a large district, you get it right and then you keep it up, gives you that updated information as things change as the year progresses.
And I think that's key. Things change so often, just incredibly fast at the state level. You prepare for one COLA, you receive another COLA 7 months later, and laying out those multi-year projections. Glad you brought it up, Mike. We do a 5-year projection, internal, in-house, and we do share it often. And sometimes it's not enough. You've got to have these really tough discussions, because even when you are in good times, you are getting COLAs. Even though we're experiencing the decline, we may be getting more revenues because of our COLAs. There's so many other factors besides enrollment decline that are affecting us, that if these conversations aren't out there on the table, they're not going to be addressed, and the school districts are going to suffer.
And so I wanted to broaden this conversation about the downsizing and these planning decisions to think a bit about what parents and local stakeholders can do. And so maybe, Sara, you can answer this. What role do and should parents and local stakeholders play in this process to make sure that these are equitable decisions that aren't disproportionately affecting some groups of students?
The good thing is about local control funding formula is we have a role. they are one of our key, they're our number one customer. We are there to serve their students, and they must be part of the conversation. We have to engage, again, as I mentioned earlier, early and often, and really informing our parents who are here, sending us their children that they trust, that are going to receive the services and supports to be the best that they can be. And so I think for us, it's really using that opportunity that has been created in our budget process. That was not what was in existence before LCFF, where they were part of the engagement. And so I think this is an opportunity that we need to tackle to really inform, as these decisions happen, what can we do as a community? Can we as a community maybe leverage resources with our cities and counties? Is there something else that we're not tapping into that we now have access to leverage? As Mike said, knowing and recognizing, are there higher education institutions that maybe can provide us with the support and resources? Are we making sure that we're addressing then the economic needs of our region? Can we shift then the direction of how we're focusing our educational instructional services? What is the demand out there? But I think that when we withhold, when we shut down, when we do have staff doing 2 to 3 responsibilities, it makes it challenging to feel that support with the community of how do I communicate to this community that we can't afford all of this? And how do we make those decisions so that they are part of the conversation, so that together we can decide, is this an opportunity that maybe we need to pass a parcel tax? Is this an opportunity to leverage some local resources, or collectively speak up to our elected officials and let them know that these are the situations that are going on in our region?
Nothing's going to bring a community out more than a discussion about school cuts, a school closing. But here's where we're at that's different than the past. We better, every school district better, have at this point, 8 years into it, 9 years into it, a well-defined, authentic stakeholder engagement process. LCAP requires it. It's a requirement, and yes, there are a lot of games played that make it look authentic in some places, and there's not one meeting held, probably, but we have that in place. We should leverage that. Again, it should guide the plan. One of the reasons we don't see a lot of school closures, and the report identifies this, is because that brings everybody out. Who wants their neighborhood school closed? Or in a small community that you're now going to drive 10, 15 miles or the other side of the valley, literally between one mountain peak and the next, right, to get to an elementary school. Nobody wants that. And so that brings a lot of folks out, and they become engaged in that process. There's no reason they can't be engaged in this, and in fact, they should have. Again, if they are informing the LCAP and the board is adopting an LCAP representative of that input, then we have our plan.
Well, and I think it's absolutely critical for schools to engage their community when they're not in that mode. Yeah. Because, it is unfortunate when you have school board meetings where there are no parents at them because nothing's going on. It's, it's all quiet. They're happy, their kids are going to school. There's nothing to complain about. But then you go to a school board meeting where they are talking about, eliminating the athletics program, and the entire community is there. Even people who don't have kids in the school, because everybody goes to those games. So it's really important for schools to actively work with their community, just to say what they do in good times and bad, to make sure that they understand how we're funded, how the resources are limited. There's always confusion with our communities about bond funds and what they can be used for, what they can't be used for, and how come you can't operate the school with those. Really trying to educate them all the time about what schools, what it takes to operate their schools and meet the needs of their students. I think it is really critical that schools do that, and for school districts that are going to now really start to decline, hopefully they have that groundwork, because it's really hard to build it when you're in the cut mode.
The most common question from the public about school finance is, didn't we solve the funding issue for schools in 1985 with the lottery? Tell me where you're spending all of those billions of dollars of lottery money. Of course, the state auditor this week has an opinion about that.
They owe us $36 million.
But it represents less than 2% of the revenue in a school district, about $140, or that's what they're being paid. Maybe that's not what they're owed, per kid per year. It didn't solve the problem, right? And those of us who have been around long enough know that in that first year, the state recouped the base lottery amount. So we're really not talking about 140. We're talking about a smaller subset of that that's actually benefiting the schools.
And so something we haven't talked about yet, but that is a hot topic both generally and within this issue are charter schools. And so, Mike, maybe you can start us off with some thoughts on this. So I know it's a touchy topic, but are there
thanks.
different policy considerations for how the state should address declines due to charter schools? So the 1-year declining enrollment protection is not given for students that move within a district to a district charter. Is that correct? And if so, is that something the state should consider revising? And how should we think about that?
So last spring, with the governor's charter task force that the state superintendent hosted and facilitated every Thursday for 3 to 5 hours, one of the first things I suggested that task force, without looking at the data, so I've learned my lesson, right? Don't open your mouth without looking at the data, was, should we extend this soft landing provision to kids that leave a district for a charter school? Because today, your lost enrollment attributable to a charter school does not qualify for the soft landing if you're in declining enrollment. The soft landing being the prior year adjustment. And so I said, that would soften the impact, right? And so everybody thought, and I mean everybody in the task force, and they weren't, certainly this was a mixed group, right? Not anybody on the same page probably. All thought that was a great idea, right? So then the challenge was on to actually find the data and then realize I just opened my mouth for something that wasn't at all reasonable. So the data looks like, for last year, the data looks like this. The 9 largest districts in the state plus Inglewood, and I care about Inglewood because I spend half my life there. They're the one district still under state receivership. Those 10 districts, their net students out last year to charter schools would have cost the state $100 million for just those 10 school districts. So I quickly went back, right, and said, I don't know what I was thinking, right? But before everybody in the Department of Finance took me on, I don't know what I was thinking. I don't think that's such a great idea, type of thing. So that's the magnitude of it. Is that where we want to spend our money? And the reason for that exception on the soft landing is important, right? When Gary Hart brought the Charter Schools Act so many years ago, it was sold on the basis that there would be no fiscal impact, right? Moving a student from a traditional public school to a charter school, funding was in essence the same. Some rules were different on how you played the game and all that, but funding in essence wasn't going to cost, there was zero fiscal impact on the state. And so that's why that exception exists still today. Or at least that's how it's generally explained. Paul's got more history on it than I do.
But I think I look at it from a little bit different lens, because as a county, we authorize a charter school, and that charter school's been in existence for 15 years. And I have to provide fiscal oversight to that charter school, and when their enrollment declines, which it has, they have no prior year protection. So they have to make cuts immediately. They have some flexibility with ed code requirements to be able to respond a little faster, but the reality is still how much can you respond? If you can still only save 50 cents on the dollar, it's a real issue. So for us, from an oversight standpoint, I've got to make sure that charter school can stay fiscally healthy as well. We have responsibilities to do that. So having that tool set in that, charter schools are public schools, and they are, the laws have changed significantly over the last number of years to provide a little more structure to them so we can eliminate the bad actors in the field. But we do need to accept their reality, and they're going to deal with everything other public schools deal with as well. And declining enrollment is one of them.
And I think that's an important observation, because when you look at the data, charter school enrollment is also reflective of the trend. So it's not like these are kids shifting from a traditional public school to charter. Yes, we have that going on, but overall, charter school enrollment reflects the trend as well. So that's a very important point.
And there's also been a shift from private schools to charter schools as well. That's something that we've talked
And that
about a little
happens
bit in the
certainly
report.
when we enter into softer economies, right? And a parent can't afford a tuition or what have you. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question before we open it up for audience Q&A. And so I'll give each audience or each panelist the opportunity to respond to this. And it's just a very broad question. And basically, is there anything that you think policymakers and those in the legislature should understand about the issue of declining enrollment that we haven't talked about, or that you think just isn't well understood or acknowledged from the state level? And Renee, I guess I'll give you the opportunity to begin.
I think that the report has brought a lot of things to light that maybe aren't necessarily in the policymakers' minds. And so hopefully this will give us an opportunity for them to think about just how declining enrollment is affecting our school districts, is affecting our county offices, is affecting our population. The people that we're affecting are the same people who are living in our communities. Our teachers that may lose their jobs are the same people that these policymakers are, protecting. And so any opportunity that we have to bring this to light and let people know is a great thing.
I think about myself as a millennial, that why are we making decisions to delay having children? And it was because of the Great Recession. We were impacted with higher education costs. Housing is really expensive. Childcare is non-existent. We decimated it. And I know from experience, having been the budget consultant for the Assembly Budget Committee on this issue, we cut early education by $1 billion. And so knowing that history and being one who's negotiating, should we even consider this path? It's very daunting to our communities, to those that we want to serve. And so knowing that their abilities at the state level of how do we want to address housing, how do we want to address workforce development and genuine salary compensations as California moves to increase minimum wage, knowing that all of those factors are really weighing on our families, on couples making decisions of, do we move in this direction? And then migration. We're seeing companies leave. Jobs today are much more flexible. Our families are not just staying in their communities and working in their communities. They work 2 hours away. And so they can make a decision of, should I place my child somewhere else outside of the boundaries of my residency? And so knowing all of those dynamics, that education should be part of the conversation as the state, as the legislature and the governor discuss all of these decisions. It's critical if we want to make sure that Californians feel supported, that Californians have a place to call home and to establish a family here.
And I think kind of tagging on that, and a comment that Mike made earlier, is it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not one-time funding for X that's going to help us. It's going to be the local community needs to be able to make decisions for what's right for them. But at the legislative level, understanding that a decision on the Health and Human Services side of the budget is going to have an impact on the education side of the budget, and what we do on the ground. So it's important to not make those decisions in a vacuum of, we need X. It's having that thought relative to the whole system, because, we've kind of suffered the fallout of shifts back to local control are great. They usually didn't come with a lot of money. And we're communities that have, very limited resources trying to adapt to these changes. So I think that really is critical when they're trying to make decisions. That it's not one size fits all.
Every element of state policy has some impact here, right? Schools are the center of our communities, and so no matter what we do, in what topic area, whether it's health and human services or certainly housing has an impact, and so we have to look at the reasons for the decline. We certainly have some migration issues. Is that, what are the reasons? Is that housing, workforce issues? Is it taxation? What are those reasons? A whole list of them, right? We have birth rate issues. Let me tell you, there's some really good data, really good positive messages in the birth rate data. 2 factors of the decline in birth rate we should be celebrating. One is our college going rates going up, and therefore people are delaying having kids while they go to college and get degrees and so on. That's something, especially in our world, we should be celebrating as educators. The second is that school-age mother or teen pregnancy programs are being eliminated and going away because there's no longer clientele. So teenage pregnancy rates are going down. That's something to celebrate, right? And so, every piece of state policy has an implication here. Is this on everybody's radar? No. Our system, especially our funding system, is designed to, and has over a long history of time, moved with the ebb and flow of population changes, right? Generally, though, as a state, we've only moved this way, right? The rate of growth has changed, but we haven't really entered into a period like we're looking at where we have an actual decrease of school-age population. Well, we've had some single periods, 2-3 year periods in some cases, but not long extended periods of an actual decrease, not a decrease in the rate of growth, but an actual decrease in absolute number. So this is a little different. So it will be something that our friends across the street begin to hear about. They certainly, in the upcoming hearings that FCMAT will testify at, they will hear this as one of the areas of concern around fiscal stability. Is there something special that they should be doing specifically to school finance? Then that's a bigger conversation for another probably time, because then do we abandon the uniformity of our funding system, right, and give more funds to a given district just because it's in a 5-year decline or what have you? Now we've done that from a policy perspective in the past when we have event-driven declines. So fires, floods, right? We provide, generally speaking, 3 years of flexibility, right? Keep your average daily attendance whole from the week before. So let's take Paradise. We have 3 years of stable funding there. We're using ADA there from the week before the fire destroyed an entire community, right? Their challenges look very different than anybody else's in the state. Let's just be honest, given what they've been through and are going through. But they're just on a magnified scale, right? When we get to the 50% idea that we can cut about 50% of the costs, something we haven't talked about, and it's in the weeds a little bit, but we also have to understand the fixed and variable cost structures of our operations, right? We touched on it a little bit, but we have to really understand how much of that budget expenditure is variable versus fixed, and I'm not sure that's all driven by state policy, right? That's just the characteristics of those expenditure items more than it is a state policy issue.
Thank you. All right, we'll turn it to the audience. Kelly is going around, and Beth with microphones, so please raise your hand if you have a question.
Hi, Terry Burns, I'm a former school board member. One thing I haven't heard you talk a lot about is with declining enrollment, you wind up limiting course options and thus pathways for kids that can impact your community. What are you seeing there? What are folks doing to address the opportunities for kids for various careers?
I can start on that. I think one of the benefits that we've in this decline is we've gotten other sources of state funding. So the CTEIG grant is something that's come along very recently and has funded a lot of those pathways for students. Long Beach actually has a strong number of options for pathways for students in those areas. And so what we've done is maximize our other resources to continue to keep those. And they are becoming a lot more part of the core curriculum, so it's not so much something that would be maybe on the forefront or something that we could turn around and say, oh, that's the first to go or that's not part of it. It's so ingrained in the way that we do business and the way that we have our students and the way that we have our coursework maintained that we're constantly looking for other resources in order to maintain those and keep up with that.
I would say that's true in our county as well. The community has been huge in those areas where the community support for a lot of our programs. We have a big ag community, so a lot of ag focus. And the community, the booster groups, et cetera, that have really helped with that to support it when the school can't. But there have been reductions in the programs offered, unfortunately. I think the trend is moving towards what can you incorporate into the base curriculum that addresses that need. And actually, those are the standards we're now working with, so that we do have not so much a career technical pathway always, but at least we have some ability to address some needs with students. But it does change depending on, there is a sheer size of the school too. At some point, you cannot maintain facilities for, a wood shop or an auto shop or, some of those, they're very expensive. And if the student population doesn't drive it, it often becomes something schools look to reduce.
Terry, as a school board member, you're faced with, and you know this because you've been through it, you're faced with, I'm required to offer ninth grade ELA, English Language Arts. I've got so many kids, they all need to be in that class. Therefore, I need that teacher with that English credential. But I've got to reduce 10 teachers, right? And so I hold on to that at the expense of the teacher with that unique credential that is supporting that program, whether it's CTE or advanced placement or international baccalaureate, or I would apply it to athletics and activities, very frankly as well. Attendance. There's a significant piece of our attendance system that's driven by it, students showing up to school because they're part of a team or part of a club or what have you each day, right? And so they're just difficult choices. I'm going to go back to what's the plan. So you got to also break that plan down by those subgroups, not just by ethnicity, by special ed, by kids in poverty, by foster or homeless. We also have to look at what's our population in those athletic programs, activity programs, advanced placement, IB, all those other CTE and so on, right? And ensure that we're doing what we can to balance that and meet those needs. It is those programs, those CTE programs and athletics and other things that obviously impact dropout rates, right? That's what, in part, helps us reverse dropout rates. Because we build an interest, the student has an interest in doing something, and they come to school every day as a result of that. So because this is a two-edged sword, right? Enrollment drop, but if we're not offering the right access to stuff, then attendance will drop too, right? And that's what we're funded on. So our attendance rate will drop, and we've got to prevent that.
Thank you all for the report and for the conversation today. It sounds like one of the big things that's coming out is we need to identify core functions, but at the same time, we're also seeing a trend towards greater mental health and behavioral health needs. There's also data showing that if those kinds of problems aren't solved or addressed in the school somewhere, it's very unlikely that they get addressed at all. So I was wondering, what are some of the barriers to working with county behavioral health departments? Maybe specifically thinking about the Mental Health Services Act. We know there's been some counties that haven't been able to spend all of that funding. How can we make sure that those, maybe not as essentially core school functions, but still very important, how do we make sure those are seamlessly being delivered in schools?
For Calaveras County, this is a huge issue. And for us, it's bodies. We don't have the people. Our mental health, our county mental health services can't find clinicians. We can't find clinicians. We, in all of our areas, our specialized positions, we really struggle to find qualified staff because of where we are, the ability of us to provide, competitive salaries when they can drive an hour, west of us and get more money. They can still live in our community, but drive farther to get paid more. And there's just a true shortage. They're not even out there to hire. So that is really a struggle for us. And then it becomes that decision at that local level, at the school level of, I have to keep the teacher, but I have to cut costs. So what's the first thing to go? They become it's a terrible decision either way. And school boards have to deal with making that decision.
So one of the things I've learned through the LCFF and LCAP process as far as implementation, you can't have a good LCAP, a plan. It's not going to have the right elements in it, have the right thought process, the right influence from our stakeholders if it's developed only in curriculum instruction or developed only in personnel or what have you. You have to break, as an organization, as school district, you have to break those silos down. Each business, personnel, student services, curriculum instruction, they all have to be together in developing that plan and in executing that plan. And so in response to your question, the same would be true as we look to our outside partners, our county partners, and I don't mean County Office of Ed, but our county government partners, or traditionally those types of public health and mental health services have been, to our private partners, right? It's those walls we put up, and some of those are not created by regulation or law right here in this town. They're created locally by not being willing to pick up the phone and call your counterpart over here and say, can we meet, for coffee and talk about what we can do for each other and how you can help our kids and this and that. And do you need facilities? Here's another opportunity, right? We're decreasing the number of classrooms. Can we now dedicate a classroom to county mental health on our campus? And that starts to look like a community school, right? Which is the governor has proposed some funding for programs like that in his Jan 10 budget. So part of it is you just have to step out. For a small county, a small district, again, it's the same person doing everything, right? So that becomes a challenge, right? In a bigger district, they've got folks dedicated still, although they're reducing them, right? They've got folks dedicated. The other issue, it's not just attracting the right people, like in a small, let's take LA for example. So last January strike, nursing was, I'm just going to pick on nurses school nurses for a second. That was one of the settlement points, right? It's one of the red shirt topics that we talk about all the time. At the time, and I won't get this exactly, but they had roughly 120 nurses. Only about 70 of those positions were filled at the time. It wasn't a lack of, it wasn't the district trying to save money. they couldn't find qualified school nurses because they're competing with the private world, the hospital and the medical world, right? So we end up with a settlement that adds a whole bunch of additional nurses, right? And where are they today? Not sure they're in any different spot than they were, right? So it's not just a small county, a remote county, what have you, that has that challenge. Now, LA may be influenced by marketplace, by housing. It gets back to, you know, the earlier point of state policy. Every element of state policy has some kind of impact.
So I think we have time for one more question. Well, maybe two if we're quick.
Hi, my name is Carter. Just want to say thank you for the great conversation today. My question is for the whole panel, but I believe it was you, Sarah, who had mentioned a parcel tax to increase some revenue that we're losing due to the declining enrollment. There's a proposed ballot measure that should be qualified for the November ballot, not the Prop 13 formed this March, but November. The Schools and Communities First Act that'll provide, roughly estimated $12 billion in revenue to local school districts. I was wondering your thoughts on that. How much that'll help, if at all, and how much that'll cover the loss of revenue due to the declining enrollment.
And that proposal is currently in circulation. They're estimating from 10 to 12 billion overall of tax revenue, but only 40% of that would go to school districts. So we're really looking at 4 to 6 billion. And again, it is a push to encourage that discussion that, unfortunately, we live in general fund land where the state collects so many resources because of the test level that we're in. We get about 40% of that, and yet that's not sufficient. And so there are initiatives out there where we're encouraging, and there's many education organizations supporting it. CASB at this time has not taken a position on that initiative. But that is the reality, that we have to have an honest conversation that in this time period, our base grant of how much we receive per student is not sufficient to pay for the cost of providing high quality education. And so if there are opportunities such as Community First, parcel tax is only available to certain regions if they have the ability to leverage those types of fees and have the support of the community. Requires 2/3 vote. We're one of the supporters of SCA 5 by Senator Hill that would change that threshold to majority vote. So these are still challenges that we have to face at the state level of what are restrictions in our ability at the local level to generate resources, and then how do we ensure equity? Because not every school district has the ability to raise a parcel tax. And so then we create a have and have-nots environment where certain areas in Central Valley don't have the assessed evaluation of properties to raise that property tax needed to provide the same level of support and services that other regions, like in San Mateo, Palo Alto, that can raise those types of resources. So what equitable decisions can the state make to ensure that if there are local opportunities to raise taxes, that everyone has access to those same tools, and then or making sure that the state can backfill or provide some sort of recognition that not all districts are created equal in terms of what they have access to.
And Carter, I would add to that, just so you have context, the latest getting down to facts studies on that try to quantify adequate school funding, identify a gap from where we were 2 years ago when the last studies came out of about 30 billion. So using that initiative as an example, and if it generates about 4 billion for schools, 4 to 6, you can see where it fits into the 30 billion roughly gap if you accept the research premise and the approach to quantifying what the adequacy gap is that's in getting down to facts. So just give you some context.
So I know I saw a couple other hands, but I apologize, we've run out of time. We can continue these conversations offline. But once again, I just wanted to thank our panelists for a very lively and thought-provoking discussion.
Thank you.
And thanks again for those who stayed to the end.